who we were, and who we're destined to become are all reflections of the stories we tell, of gods and devils from tales of the heart to those of fear and foreboding. Stories shape us in the world we live in. Myths, folk tales, and even religious parables all define our cultures and beliefs. In each episode of Faith and Fear, we will dip our toes into the comparative narratives spanning the globe, considering the concepts and archetypes common to us all. And lay shalom and prazir, hello and peace. It's a pleasure. Thanks for following me down the rabbit hole once again in my journey to better understand the stories and beliefs that shape us. In many ways, the stories we tell and the lessons we pass on are like a tree. There are branches that reach out into generations and cultures, sometimes in obvious ways, and other times reaching surprising new places. Aaron Mahnke, The World of Lore, Wicked Mortals. Welcome back. This week I'm happy to bring you another explorative episode with another incredible guest. Author Kirsten Weiss joins me to talk about her experiences working abroad, namely the folklore and superstitions she's encountered while living among other cultures in various parts of the world. We cover a lot during our conversation, so it gets a bit all over the place, and is a long one to say the least, but Kirsten was a thrill to talk to, and her stories are absolutely entertaining, ones I'm sure you'll enjoy. So without further ado, I bring you Folklore and Superstitions Abroad with Kirsten Weiss. This week, I'd like to introduce you to genre-blending author Kirsten Weiss. Kirsten, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Good. I cannot complain. It's getting a little cold here, but other than that, pretty good.
Yeah, the temperature's dropping here too. I'm in Colorado Springs. It's supposed to get down to 30 tomorrow.
Oh, nice. Kirsten and I have been emailing back and forth for a little while now. Kirsten, I'm glad to finally have you on. Could you tell everyone a bit about yourself?
Oh gosh. Yeah, I worked overseas for about 20 years, and I was in something called microcredit, which is making very small loans to people who had little stalls in a bazaar, for example, to help them buy inventory and improve their business. And then when I came back to the United States, I thought, gosh, I've been working in all these crazy places, Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, I can do anything. And I had the hardest time finding a job. I did finally get a job as a financial planner, and I really hated it. And after 2 years, I ended up leaving it and was back in the same spot where everybody wanted to interview me because I had this weird resume, but nobody really wanted to hire me because I didn't fit in. And something I'd wanted to do since I was a child was to write mystery novels. So basically out of desperation, I wrote one, and it wasn't very good, to be honest. I have edited the heck out of it since and improved it quite a bit. But on my second try, I got a professional editor, and then I got an offer from a writers cooperative, which is a group of writers who get together and edit each other's work and help publish each other's work. And then from there, I got an agent and some traditional publishing deals. And now I'm what's known as a hybrid author, because I publish traditionally, but I also am publishing through my authors cooperative.
Right. I was actually interested in going a similar route. And I think we all kind of tend to be hard on our own work, more so than, outside influences.
Yeah, it's a blessing and a curse, because I think on the one hand, we should be hard on our work so we can make it as good as possible. But on the other hand, it can stop you from publishing.
Right. And Honestly, I think most of us expect we go into it with our first work being, like our masterpiece, but that's not how it works. You're supposed to start off with horrible work and it's supposed to get better over time. Just like with anything else, you start off at whatever level and you just get better because you're learning and you're growing and you're developing those skills. So I think just starting out is like a huge step, and maintaining that, sticking with it, that's like the hardest part.
Yeah, I honestly think that's the key to success. So many big name writers just tried and tried and tried and tried, and when they were on the verge of giving up, that was when the breakthrough happened.
Right, exactly. I've already described your work as genre blending. Could you tell us a little about the types of books that you write?
Sure. Well, each genre has certain expectations when you're writing genre fiction. For example, today's cozy mysteries are usually set in a small town. There'll be an amateur detective. There'll usually be a pet. There'll be a lot of quirky characters. And the murder is always solved at the end of the books. And my cozy mysteries have all of that. But my Wits End cozy mystery, for example, is set in a bed and breakfast with a UFO theme. So there's a lot of UFO and alien discussion, which is kind of unusual for a cozy mystery. And the Wits End series is set in the same imaginary town as my Doyle Witch Mystery series. Now, today's witch mysteries, if you're talking about genre, are typically very light and fluffy and fun, and they have talking cats and witches are riding around on brooms. And I'd actually intended to do that when I started writing the Witches of Doyle series, but almost immediately the story kind of took one of those turns I didn't actually expect and got a lot more serious. I still don't know why or how that happened, but the cats don't talk, and the magic in the books is based on magic that practitioners are actually doing today. The results are more spectacular than a Wiccan would potentially get or a shaman might get, but I still try to be as accurate as possible with the magic and the folklore, and I treat the magic a lot more seriously in my witch mysteries than is typical of the genre. Although I'm sure it's not unique. There's probably some other books out there that are doing the same thing.
Right. I like that. That sounds like a great way to do that.
Well, and I have a lot of fun with having two series set in the same town, especially because one is magic and one is not magic, because I get to play a bit with the perspective. For example, the witches in my witch mystery look at the problems in Doyle and the disappearances of people, and they think fairies are responsible. Whereas the normies in my Wits End series think that aliens are responsible. And the joke is that if you look at reports of fairy abductions from the 1800s, they're almost identical to reports of UFO abductions. You got lights in the sky, weirdly tall people or strangely short people, probing, it's all there. So it's just fun. And it's, of course, who knows what's going on with that.
That sounds very intriguing. Sounds like something I'm definitely going to have to check out myself.
Oh, thank you. And then with my, can I keep talking about myself?
Oh, go for it.
All right. Well, with my shorter fiction, I get a little more experimental. So for example, I've got a novelette called The Melancholy Detective, which is sort of an urban fantasy. And I based it around this book from the 17th century called The Anatomy of Melancholy. And the book is starting to take over the main character, but the whole structure of the story is based on the structure of that book. And then I have another short story told entirely, it's an urban fantasy told entirely in postcards from the detective to her husband. And another, again, going back to my Doyle Witch series, one of the witches in the books writes romance novels. So I had her write a paranormal romance novel, but then I thought, I have to do something, I have to bring her into it more. So in between each chapter, I have her story, which is told through letters and newspaper articles and emails and such. And that's actually a horror story. So I've got this paranormal romance / mystery with a horror story weaving through it. And it's all, yeah, anyways. So that was a novella, so that was a bit shorter in length as well. But it was a lot of fun to write, to play with things like that. And right now I'm working on I'm talking about myself too much. I'm sorry.
Oh, not at all. I brought you on to talk about yourself and your experiences, so it's perfectly fine. So it sounds like a lot of your inspiration comes from supernatural narratives or supernatural stories and things of that nature.
Very much so. Not just the supernatural stories, but again, what people are doing. I grew up in the Bay Area, and when I came home from overseas, I initially returned to the Bay Area, and I got to know a lot of people who were practitioners, who were shamans and astrologers and goddess worshippers and pagans. And I was very interested in exactly what they were doing and how they were doing it. And I very much enjoy introducing that bit of reality into the stories. I feel like the more reality you can have in a fantasy story, the more the reader is grounded in it and the more real it feels.
Was there anything in particular about those practices that you witnessed that caught your attention?
I am really intrigued by shamanism, because shamanism is ancient and it goes back, we don't know how far it goes back, but let's just say thousands of years at least. And it seems to weave through a lot of different practices. For example, in some shamanic practices, the shamans will have an out-of-body experience, and his, I'll just say, spirit or consciousness will rise up on the smoke of a fire into upper worlds and then have experiences in upper world. And if you look at stories of witchcraft from the Middle Ages, there are stories of witches doing the same thing, riding up the smoke of a fireplace and then flying off. So there are all these funny little parallels that you start seeing. And I don't know that there's a connection there, but I strongly suspect there's a connection there. And it just seems like a lot of shamanism has to do with, there's also, it seems, a lot of similarities between what shamans do and modern psychology. I think it's a big part of the human experience. Even though most people aren't shamans and don't go to shamans, there seems to be something there our unconscious, which just keeps popping out in a shamanic way.
Absolutely. I think those are some of the things that I've tried to focus on, is that there really does seem to be a parallel with practices that are on completely opposite ends of the world, and you might not think that they're related. You don't think that these two completely different traditions have anything to do with one another, but when you start taking close glances at some of the actual practices and how some of these practices are exercised, you really do start to see the similarities, and that there has to be some kind of relation.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And shamanism also, because shamanism in various ways has been practiced all over the world, in Asia, Africa, Scandinavia, Latin America. It's not exactly the same, but there's this thing called core shamanism, which a man named, I think his name was Michael Harner, started kind of looking at what are the things that are the same in all these different shamanic practices. And it's a real rabbit hole. The more you go down these things, the more you learn and the more fascinated you can become by it, and the more it branches out, because there are so many connections.
No, it's absolutely fascinating, and it really is a rabbit hole. And when you start nitpicking things and you start unraveling the threads that seem to kind of bind everything together, it's very easy to kind of get lost in it. So I absolutely understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think you mentioned you had a psychopomp on a few weeks ago. And
Right.
That's a very shamanic practice. It's going from one world to the next. It's, guiding the spirits. It's talking with the spirits. Well, I don't know what your psychopomp, I'm going to have to listen to the show now, so I don't know what he or she was saying. But that whole journey from one world to the other is very shamanic.
Right. And shamans were
it was a solo episode, so it was just me, but I was looking at some of the different psychopomp practitioners or deities that exist in different cultures, and shamans were among them, because shamans generally, help people journey from one life to the next, or even if it's just journeying to alternate planes, and they, as you said, perform practices that psychologists perform. They try to help people through mental issues or trauma and things of that nature. So it's funny how some of these old or even ancient practices are still exercised today, but just in a different form, and we don't realize how long some of these have existed. They've just evolved, I guess you could say, in a way like everything else.
Yeah, it's a weird, wonderful world.
Absolutely. The main reason I wanted to talk to you was your particular background, which I found especially interesting. Your experiences working abroad must have been life-changing, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, we're really sheltered in America and we don't realize it. Life is so much easier here than in many, many, many other parts of the world. And I started out in the Peace Corps in 1994, and then I ended up in Kyrgyzstan doing that microcredit that I mentioned, and continued with that for decades. And that was when it was after the Soviet Union had fallen apart. There was a lot of chaos, there was a lot of corruption, and it was always in your face. There was always a cop trying to shake you down. There was always some, horrible accident that could have been prevented, or, somebody died too young for some stupid reason. Power going off. It was frustrating, but it was also kind of inspiring seeing all the people who were just living and getting through it and not complaining about it very much. I mean, that was life, and you could either take a dim view of it and bitch about it all the time, pardon my language, or you could get on and live your best life under the circumstances that you're faced with. And that's what we're doing. And for me as an American, when I'd come from such easier circumstances, I'm ashamed to say that it was much easier for me to fall into the, complaining and outrage mindset, which I had to get out of.
Absolutely. I can easily see that. So where did you work exactly? What parts of the world?
I started out in the former Soviet Union. After the wall had come down a few years later, Peace Corps started getting involved there. And I was in Estonia, which is part of the Baltic states. And then I went to Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia. And then after that, I bounced over to the Republic of Georgia, which is on the Black Sea and near Turkey. And then Afghanistan happened, and a friend of mine asked me to go out there because she couldn't get anybody else. And so I said, okay. And I lasted there a year, and I thought that was enough. And then I ended up in North Africa and down to Ethiopia. At that point, I was just working part-time and kind of going in and out. I'd stopped working over there permanently. Oh, and I forgot Pakistan. How could I forget Pakistan? I was there for several years. That was another interesting spot.
I can only imagine. And I also imagine those are vastly different places to live and work.
Yeah, the former Soviet Union, for all of its problems, was a fairly egalitarian society. And then Afghanistan was a war zone. Pakistan, the U.S. government was considering it a war zone, although it really wasn't. Sectors of it or states were quite anarchic at the time. And then being a Western woman in countries like that, like Afghanistan and Pakistan, was eye-opening as well. It was very different.
Right. You talked a little bit about just being around people and their difference of perspective, the fact that they were just looking at life in a different way. You've already mentioned before that you've encountered different types of stories. Could you talk a little bit about that? I'm sure you know that's one of the main things I wanted to ask you. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the stories that you heard, especially the folklore or native legends?
Yeah, one of the things we've been talking about are the superstitions, and especially in Kyrgyzstan that was a country where I really started encountering that more and more as a part of people's lives. And some of it was funny and some of it was sad. I think a lot of it had to do with, again, when you're living in an anarchic country where the police are not your friends, you don't have a lot of control over your life. And so turning to superstitions and folklore is a way to cope with it. So, for example, one of my colleagues' very young daughters died quite unnecessarily. And it was, horrible for everybody. And his wife became convinced that a curse had been cast upon her by a jealous woman. And so she had a exorcist come out from the church and exorcise the house, and I guess exorcise her or whatever. And as part of that, they painted these black crosses all over the wall on various walls. And I started noticing more and more of those crosses as I went into other people's houses and understanding that exorcisms had been performed there. And this woman, it was her way, I think, of taking back control, even if it was a false sense of control. But I think it really did help her ultimately kind of get through it. So I think it was, part of me was thinking it's not a positive thing because it's not changing anything. It's not changing the reason why this child needlessly died. It's not fixing it. But realistically, she couldn't have fixed it. So it was fixing it for her, and maybe that was all she could do.
In some ways, it was likely a coping mechanism.
Exactly.
I guess that's probably a good way to look at it. Sometimes, and I think the origins with like a lot of these superstitions come from places of, as you said, trying to take some level of control over some part of your life that you really don't have any control over, whether it's illnesses or losing a child, anything of that nature.
Yeah. And then there were crazy things that happened. The office I was working in was in an old grammar school that had been sold off. And a Korean church had taken over part of the school grounds as well. One day, there was a very small group of women and me in the office. Everybody else was out and about. And we heard these horrible, blood-curdling screams coming from somewhere on the grounds. And I wanted to call the police, and everybody shot that idea down because you never called the police at that time in Kyrgyzstan. They were the enemy. And finally I said, we have to, listen, something horrible is happening. We have to do something, find out what's going on. And if something awful is going on, then we're going to call the police. So four of us, including the guard, went out to find out what was going on. And we followed the screaming to a building, and we opened the door, and there's a woman lying on the floor, and there's a guy sitting on a desk beside her playing the guitar, and there's a few people kind of standing around. And they all just shocked look at us. And so I said through the translator something along the lines of, we heard some screaming. We just wanted to make sure everything was okay. And they just stared at us. And so we continued on. Well, we just wanted to make sure, if they're screaming in here, is everybody all right? No response. So, well, whatever's going on, could you maybe hold it down? Because obviously nobody was being killed at this point. And again, no response. And finally, one of the people said, we're having an exorcism. It's like, okay, but can you hold it down a little bit? Because these screams were really awful. It sounded like somebody was being boiled in oil. It was horrible. So we leave, and my colleagues were like, we told you there was nothing going on. I was like, well, okay. But then I realized afterwards, when I was thinking about their really shocked reaction when we walked in, I will bet they thought that we were the demons that had somehow appeared during the exorcism, because we were so weird. I mean, here we are,
And that's
by the sunlight, this really tall, comparatively, white woman comes walking in with these much, shorter people. The white woman is speaking in tongues. The shorter people are translating for her. I mean, it was just a bizarre experience, which I'm kind of laughing about now. That was really scary when we were just hearing the screaming going on. But it was just, weird stuff like that was happening on a fairly regular basis when I was in Kyrgyzstan. And none of the other countries were like that. I don't know what it was about Kyrgyzstan, if I was just lucky or unlucky to have these experiences. But there was always something going on, and it always seemed to be connected to some sort of folk belief or superstition or religious belief or whatever you want to call it. And it really made me just think more about how superstition plays into our lives. And it makes me wonder how, as Americans, the things that we believe, how much of it is real and how much of it is actually superstition? How much do we tell ourselves, oh, that's science? Oh, this expert said it? And how much of it is just not true at all, but just something we tell ourselves to, get along in society or to make ourselves feel better?
And there's a lot of things that are ingrained in culture, like the culture of whatever country that you're within. So that's entirely likely. And I think it's kind of funny that the way you put that, it was just weird timing that you walked in when you did, as they were performing this exorcism. I could see them being a little shocked and surprised that, as they're doing this, these people just walk in at the right time.
Yeah, so we were terrified of them and they were terrified of us. And
right.
It was all ridiculous. Actually, maybe not. I hope the woman who was getting exercise got the help she needed.
Right. So were there any interesting stories when you were in Russia?
There's a lot of little things. Like in Kyrgyzstan, you were not supposed to compliment, you weren't supposed to say, oh, what a cute baby, or what a beautiful little girl, because that would attract the attention of evil spirits. So you'd be calling in the bad spirits. It was considered very bad form. So I had to learn how to stop saying stuff like that.
Right.
And in fact, some of the kids' names translated to things like, this one's not so special, pay no attention, kind of small, kind of runty, just to keep the bad spirits away.
I've actually came across some stuff like that when just doing research for names for some of the stories I've written, that those are actual practices, because you don't want to bring or draw attention from those negative spirits. You kind of want to do something like that, or it's the opposite of a lot of other parts of the world where they name a kid after a biblical name or something like protected by God or anything of that nature. It's kind of like you're naming somebody something that makes them less desirable.
Yeah. It's interesting that that's not just in Kyrgyzstan, that there's so many other places, so many other people have that, or cultures have that same idea. Because there's some root superstition that's embedded in human consciousness or in our subconscious that keeps springing up with that.
Right. And again, we go to the superstitions of, I'll use Lilith as a perfect example. I'm sure you're aware of the story of Lilith, but I know they used certain amulets or certain names or words or whatnot to keep her away, because she was believed to be a demonic female spirit that would come and harm your children at night. But a lot of times those kind of stories were likely to a way to prevent illnesses or mishaps that were so common in early childbirth or early child development that they didn't know how to deal with it any other way. So they came up with these practices, these superstitions, these rituals to exert some level of control over something that, as we said before, they normally have no control over. Even today, we only have so much control over those kind of things happening.
Yeah, I mean, I frequently diss on the old Soviet healthcare system, but the reality is here in America, I think doctors' mistakes are the third leading cause of death in America. So we're not in control. We like to think we are, but we're not.
No, even you can do everything that you're supposed to do, and sometimes things aren't going to go the way that you want.
Yeah, and then how do you cope with it?
Ultimately, we can't control everything. We can do our best to anticipate every variable and try to prepare ourselves for anything that could go wrong, but there's only so much we can do. I mean, we are, for better or worse, human. So I can see it's debated even more so today, having these beliefs, because, you know, especially here in America, we like to think of ourselves as an intelligent society. We like to think of ourselves as past certain superstitions or ritualistic practices. But there does seem to be a rise in going back to those things. Most people do prefer to shy away from those beliefs. And it's weird to me to think about, because we shy away from those things and we go to more modern superstitions, but they're still superstitions. We don't like to think of them as that. We don't like to think of them in that way, but ultimately that's exactly what they are.
Yeah, and I think some can hurt and some can help. I think, you know, sometimes if you feel like things are going better, if you get a sense of, I hate the word empowerment, but if you feel empowered, if you're feeling more confident, if you're feeling lucky, or just in a more positive frame of mind, and if some ritual kind of helps you get there, you still have the effect of, if you're feeling more positive and in a better space, then things do tend to work. You tend to see opportunities. You tend to look at the world, you know, more kindly. Good things do tend to happen when you're in a better frame of mind, it seems. And I think like a good tarot reading can do wonders. A bad tarot reading can also do really awful things to you if you get in the hands of a corrupt tarot reader. So it's a double-edged sword.
Absolutely. And I look at faith in the same way. The way you worded that is kind of how I tend to look at those kind of things. And I think that charms, or whatever you want to call them, if it puts you in the right mindset, and sometimes, scientifically speaking, people have looked at these kind of things, you know, like good luck charms, rabbit foot, all of those types of things, and they actually do have an effect on the person that's carrying them. Personally, I don't think it matters whether it's just simply changing their perspective and that they're thinking more positively, so more positive things happen. Regardless of what you want to call it, the charm is working. It might not be working the way, you know, in a magical sense, but it's still working.
Yeah, there's this idea from the Western magical tradition that magic is a spell that you cast on yourself. So you can change your own view of the world or how you see the world, and then you change how you behave within the world and you're interacting with the world. And once you change how you're interacting with the world, in response, you know, the people around you are also going to interact with you differently. And I think that's interesting. And I think there's something to that.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I've actually came across some of those beliefs myself. I've read a little bit into some of those teachings, and it's definitely a positive way of looking at things and exerting, if not your control, your influence on your own life. Because I mean, like we said, you ultimately can't control everything, but you can influence things. and you can push things in the right direction. And if these beliefs help you do that, I don't personally see an issue in it. I think it's where you obsess over them or you follow them blindly where you get into dangerous territory.
Yeah, there's definitely a dark side to the occult. People who take themselves way too seriously. People who get more into the demonic aspects of it. Yeah, it's not good. It's not healthy for anybody, I don't think. And it is definitely, yeah, it's something to be aware of. There's this interesting debate on Christian Twitter about, it's not really a debate. I'm starting to see a lot of comments from Christian Twitter about the occult and Ouija boards and, you know, this, that, and the other thing, and reading these books. And I think they go too far. But there is a point. I mean, things do go wrong. Like you say, people do get obsessed. People do let it take over their lives. And people open themselves up to darknesses, you know, within themselves that maybe they shouldn't.
I look at it in the sense that there's a lot of things that we as humans take part in that can be healthy, even beneficial in small doses, but some people don't know when to stop or where to draw the line.
Yeah.
And I use examples like alcohol. Some people can drink a single beer every day or have a couple beers on the weekends. And then you have other people that they just can't drink one case at a time. They're full-blown alcoholics because they aren't able to exert any level of control over their weakness for that substance. And a lot of people have that weakness. It just may not be for alcohol. Some people have it with video games. Some people have it with shoe shopping. Some people have it with soft drinks. And I think most of us kind of have our weakness, our susceptibility to something of that nature. And I think we have to realize that it's there, so you kind of shouldn't give somebody else crap about theirs because, you know, we all kind of have that thing. And I don't know, it's one of those buttons for me just because of the way I grew up and the people that I grew up around. So I've known people with addictions in my life. I have people with addictions who are very close to me. And to see how easily it is to fall into those traps, it's not always something that's negative, because it can be something that's very positive. That could be an addiction that ends up not being healthy because you become obsessed with it. And we see this with like religious zealots. You know, religion isn't bad in and of itself, but people become obsessed with it and blinded by it, and it ends up becoming a dark thing because of the people's obsession over what's right and what's wrong, their beliefs versus other people's beliefs. So to me, it's all akin to one another. You know, you have to learn balance. Basically, you have to learn where to draw the line somewhere.
Yeah, I think when you start studying these things, you need to go into it with your eyes open. And the old adage, know yourself, know where your weaknesses are. You're the type of person who's going to go too far down the rabbit hole.
And I think that's another reason why it's important to learn about other beliefs or other perspectives or other walks of life, because when you're surrounded by nothing but what you've heard or been told your entire life, it's very easy to be susceptible to the negative side of things or to fall down the rabbit hole. Just, you know, alter your perspective a little bit, or make your perspective open to other things. I guess that's the best way to put it.
Yeah, I agree.
I've grown up around religious people my whole life. And for me personally, it was probably around the time I was 15. I was told some things in Sunday school that didn't sit right with me. And you don't learn a whole lot about other cultures and stuff in school, but you do learn a little bit. Like, you learn a little bit in social studies about other religions and stuff like that. Well, what I was being told in Sunday school and what I was hearing elsewhere from either people that practice these things or just other educators talking about it conflicted. Like, the two narratives just were conflicting with one another. So I started doing my own research, because at the time I grew up during the 90s. I was in high school, late 90s. And internet was becoming, more prominent. So there was a little more access to learn about other things and learn about paganism or Buddhism or anything that's outside of what I was raised around. And the more I started learning on my own, the more I kind of distanced myself from what I was raised to believe, just as a part of trying to discover what it is I myself believed. And I think it's important for most of us to do that, to kind of take that journey to learn what's out there.
Yeah, there's so much out there, and now, with today's communication and today's travel, it's so much easier to explore it. Whether you're exploring something online or actually getting on a plane and going there, and it's tremendously exciting. It's tremendously mind blowing. It's just especially when you get to spend a little more time outside the tourist spots and just talking to people. It's we're so lucky to live when we do. In spite of all the challenges of today's politics and what's going on in the world, life is good. I mean, our life expectancy is, back when Social Security was implemented, I think this life expectancy was 63 years old in America, which is why they made Social Security start at 65 years old. But, now we're living into our 90s, and it's not too unusual to know people who are in their hundreds. And we're not scratching for food anymore. We've got plenty around us. It's life is great, and there are so many opportunities to explore other facets of it.
Right. And don't get me wrong, I'm completely aware that there's also a lot of misinformation out there. And I think that's something that we also have to be careful of. And I think that's why it's even more important to kind of do your own research, but not just do your research. You have to evaluate where the information is coming from. One of the classes that I took a couple years ago, that was one of the things that they try to drill into us is, like, especially with the internet, there's access to all of this information. It's even more important that you evaluate how valid that information is. And some things you can't validate, like religious beliefs. You can't validate those things. But I do think it's important that when it comes to religious beliefs, if you're looking at what, for instance, Muslims believe, I think it's important for you to actually talk to an actual Muslim, then go by somebody who's repeating rhetoric that they heard from somebody else who knows absolutely nothing about the Muslim religion.
No, I agree. I mean, to take that back to superstition and the occult, there's a widely held belief that millions of witches were burned in Europe during the Middle Ages, or whenever. Is that the Middle Ages or the Renaissance? Anyways, when the witches were being burned. And that came from a German, I want to call him a scholar, but he might not have been, back in the 1800s, who took one part of Germany where there had been witch trials, and he just extrapolated. There had been some really terrible witch trials, and he extrapolated that across all of Europe, and he came up with millions. But that was a very bad way to do the math. And they actually do have records for the most part of witches who were killed, because most of the trials were secular. And when you look at the records, even accounting for records that were destroyed during the war, the number is more somewhere between, I think, 60,000 and 250,000, which is still terrible, but it's not millions. So it's, things like this. There's all sorts of pagan and paranormal scholarship, which frankly isn't very good. And we need to look at that critically and double check our sources and figure out where those things are coming from as well.
Absolutely. I know there are a lot out there. Do you have a favorite folk story, legend, or myth?
Well, since we were talking about Russia and the Soviet Union, I love the Baba Yaga story of the old witch in the woods who lives in house of chicken legs that can get up and move around. I think that's brilliant. I actually used it in one of my books. Not so obviously, but she was there. And I love all the old, the European folk tales too. I think because I grew up on them, and the Greek myths are still very powerful, I believe. So it's kind of what you grow up with, I guess. What about you?
It's funny that you bring up Baba Yaga, because Vasilisa the Beautiful is actually one of my favorite stories, and I'm actually also incorporating parts of that story and Baba Yaga into one of my books. So I actually find that kind of funny. I like a little bit of everything, honestly, and it's a fairly recent thing for me. I kind of came into my realization of my love for folklore, fairy tales, maybe within like the last 5 or 6 years. And it's kind of just grown. Just hearing the original fairy tales and things of that nature. I've always loved mythology, but again, it was mostly centered around Greek or Egyptian mythology, things that I was exposed to in school. But as I've done more exploring, especially for my own stories, I kind of just love learning about all of the variations of similar stories and the different creatures and concepts that are just like all over the world. One of my favorite creatures or entities, I guess you could say, is the Jinn. I'm sure you've probably heard stories of the Jinn. Did you ever hear any Jinn stories when you were abroad?
Not so much, but when I was in Jordan for work, and
right.
I think it was Petra. They had this giant block of stone. It's probably 7 feet square, and it's supposed to be a jinn. Or it was a jinn trap. The jinn was connected to the stone somehow.
Okay.
So when I'm traveling, I'm always on the lookout for things that are connected to legends and
artifacts like that. Yeah.
Exactly. So that was fun.
Those parts of the world, there's still a heavy belief in jinn, and I've heard stories where they still perform exorcisms for jinn. Things that you would commonly attribute to other creatures, whether it's hauntings or fae activity, a lot of people believe, oh, those are just jinn, because they exist in this world that's right next to ours and we just can't see them. So they're probably in the room with you. You just can't see them because they're invisible or whatever. So those kind of stories. For my first book, I did a lot of research into Japanese mythology, learning about Shintoism, its pantheon of gods. I did a lot of research on Japanese yokai, which are basically similar to European fairies, where yokai is basically just an umbrella term that describes all kinds of different Japanese monsters and creatures. Contrary to popular belief, fairies are the same thing. Fairies include gnomes and what we commonly think of fairies are usually what are defined as pixies, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Pixies are like the little creatures with the wings and whatnot.
The cutesies.
Yeah, fairies are like all of the above. They can include banshees and red caps and all these other things.
I actually work a lot with the fairy folklore in my Doyle series, and I take the fairies as more chaotic and dangerous, and occasionally helpful, but you can't really count on them. From the old Celtic, where the fairies were beautiful and mysterious, but if you go with them, you may never be seen again and may end up as their slave or just dead.
They've always, from my understanding, they've always came across as a trickster species. They're not necessarily evil, but they're not exactly good either. They're very self-serving in a way. I would even go so far as to say self-serving. I would go so far as to say that they're very interested in what will entertain them. As long as you're entertaining them, then they're more likely to like you or pay attention to you. If you bore them, then they're generally going to not want to have anything to do with you. So sometimes it's probably safer to be boring when it comes to that regard,
Yeah, they're kind of sociopaths.
Yeah, and you get into things like changelings, where they're abducting your children or even spouses and replacing them with something else. And
my understanding was the view of fairies took a turn for the cotton candy sweetness and light with wings during the Victorian era, when they were I can't remember. I think it has something to do with the view of children at the same time sort of changed in the Victorian era. They were kind of equating children with fairies and, oh, how cute they are.
Right. And I think similar things happen with, you see cherubs became little babies with wings, and a lot of fairy tales kind of became watered down compared to their original narratives, their origins, which are way darker and more violent than what people know today. You tell some people now, oh, well, this happened in the original story of Sleeping Beauty, and they're just going to look at you like, what? I thought that was a children's story.
Yeah, it was a hardcore children's story. Yeah, I think in some ways the old folklore was meant as lessons, but they were real hard lessons. You go out into the woods, you could die.
Exactly.
Nobody's going to save you.
That's what the point was. The point was to scare children, was to literally give them legit warnings. Don't do this because it's entirely possible that this could happen to you, or it was to scare them into behaving, basically trying to terrorize them into doing what they're supposed to be doing. So yeah, they were dark and they were violent and they were way crueler than anything we would expose children to today.
Yeah, well, life back then was much darker and more violent.
Oh, absolutely.
So I picked up when I was in the Peace Corps in Estonia, I picked up a book of Estonian children's tales in an attempt to improve my reading comprehension. And they were horrible. There was one, and apparently this was really done, where they would take a virgin and wall her up in the walls of a new castle to protect the castle. They would use a live person as the cornerstone, essentially, of a castle, and that was how the person would die, walled up alive in a castle. And this was in the children's book, and they have the girl being walled up alive, and then they have her skeleton drawn, and it's like, it was so gruesome and ghoulish, but it was what was done.
That sounds so similar to stories of virgin sacrifices, or virgins being thrown into the volcano to appease a volcano god or spirit or whatever, or European stories where the virgins were fed to the dragon to appease the dragon or protect the land. It sounds like the same kind of narrative. And again, it goes back to one of those archetypes that you see in different parts of the world, and you see the same idea that there's a sense of purity or protection that's equated with virginity, which today we kind of try to steer away from that because there's very negative connotations when it comes to it. But it's interesting to see that some of the same ideas were spread all over.
I'm sorry, I don't know what to say to that. I should say something clever, and I can't.
It's just one of those things. And
yeah, I think there's a virgin joke in there somewhere, but I write cozy mysteries, so I don't think I'm going to make it.
it's just one of those things, and I think I don't even really think that there are words for it, honestly. I know in my research of stories, for my book, I also did a lot of looking into Chinese folk stories, like Journey to the West. That's one of my favorite stories. You have, the Monkey King, Sun Wukong, which was the inspiration for the popular anime Dragon Ball Z. I also drew from, I can't remember the exact title of it. I think it was The White Snake, which is a very popular Chinese story. It's way too complicated to explain here. There was another story called The Butterfly Lovers, which is a very Romeo and Juliet type of story. Very tragic ending, and not to spoiler alert, but the two lovers basically end up dying at the end and become butterflies. So there you have another, similar narrative where you have two young people fall in love. Their family doesn't want them to be together, and they basically end up dying at the end to be together, kind of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, what are the odds that Shakespeare heard that story all the way from China? I'd say probably pretty low. It had to have been something universal.
Right. I know there's definitely incarnations of it today in different media and things of that nature, but the likelihood of that back then probably wasn't as high as it would be today. I've also done a lot of looking into some of the different African stories, like stories of the Orisha and how they've changed across the diaspora. And it's interesting to look at stories like that, or even East European stories where you have these figures that are incarnated into American versions. Things like Briar Rabbit, which draws a lot from like traditional African stories, but then you also have it be retranslated into things like Bugs Bunny.
I never thought of Bugs Bunny as Briar Rabbit.
Yeah, there's a lot of connections between Bugs Bunny and Briar Rabbit, and I'm not 100% as far as like facts go, but I'm pretty sure a lot of the inspiration was drawn from Briar Rabbit and some of those early stories. There's a lot of other figures I can't think of off the top of my head. I have like so many different figures and characters and stuff from like different parts of the world. I'll get like a glimpse of something and it's like just way too many things.
Yeah, recently I've been writing a lot about Bigfoot.
Okay.
And there are some people have some very passionate opinions about Bigfoot.
Yeah. Yes.
I take no sides. I think all the theories are very interesting. I think actually my favorite theory is that he's more of a spirit of the forest than a physical creature that's just been really good at hiding from us for all these years.
I like that idea.
Yeah, it makes more sense to me. And I have a friend who's a witch who had a spirit encounter with Bigfoot that she told me about, and I was like, but yeah, this makes sense to me.
That makes me think of the Leshy. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
The Leshy is, I want to say Slavic. I'm pretty sure it's a European creature or folk figure. Off the top of my head, it's kind of like Sasquatch in the sense of like being a tree spirit, but it's more so literally a tree spirit. It's made up of like the woods and things like that. It's a green man basically. Mm-hmm. And if I recall, one of the things about his ability or his nature is that he protects the woods and things like that, but his size is equivalent to how deep in the woods he is. So like if you're able to say escape the woods or run away from the woods, he'll start shrinking the closer he gets to like the border. So if you piss him off, get out of the woods.
There's a when I started researching Bigfoot, and specifically Bigfoot in Northern California, one of the legends I came across was from the local Indians who believed they called them the Watchers in the hills on the peninsula between the ocean and the bay. And some people surmise that that's basically Bigfoot, although it's not clear from the legend if there's a one-to-one comparison about it, but it's the same general idea and same general location. And there have been a lot of Bigfoot sightings in the Santa Cruz area recently, so it's fun to think about.
Well, Bigfoot is one of those creatures that there's incarnations or versions of him all over the world. You have Sasquatch, you have Bigfoot, you have the Yeti. There's others that are slightly different. There's one called the Billy Ape. There's another one in China or Japan, I can't remember, that's very dark. It's known to assault people. Mm-hmm. I'll put it that way, and I'll leave it at that. That's the way, if I remember correctly, that's the way it increases its numbers. It literally assaults travelers and breeds that way. I'm trying to think of the nicest.
Yeah, okay. I think I'm getting the picture.
Yeah. I can't remember the exact name.
Delicate about it.
Yeah, there's another one I can't remember. But I know there's at least a half a dozen variations on just the Bigfoot alone. And then you have cryptids in general are very hot button issues for some people. I know the Mothman is a very big one in recent years.
Yeah, like I said, people get very passionate. I've had some letters where people were debating me about whether Bigfoot was a spirit or a physical being. Like,
have you heard?
I don't care.
Have you heard of Dogman? That's another one.
No, did you say Dogman?
That's another more recent one. He's, from my understanding, he's somewhere in between Bigfoot and a werewolf. Like, he's very more so. Some stories I've heard he's more like Bigfoot. Other stories I've heard he's more like a werewolf. So that's yeah. And then you get into, there's the Wendigo. That's another one that's sometimes seen as similar but very different.
I think there was an X-Files about the Wendigo.
I did a Halloween episode on the Wendigo last year, and that's traditionally a Native American story, folklore. It's related to periods of famine where people run out of food. So in desperation, they turn to their only source of meat that's nearby. If you get where I'm going.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's the focus of the episode I did was on 2 or 3 true crime cases where I think one of them was in the 1800s. I think the other one was like early 1900s, where the one was a guy went camping with his entire family, including like the grandmother and stuff, and he was like the only one survived. And when the police or whatever went to go check and find out what happened, they basically discovered that he had fed on everybody.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And
I'm surprised when humans behave so badly for the rest of us to think that's not a human being anymore. We
and that's,
don't want to admit that awfulness could be inside of us, so we have to turn them into an actual paranormal monster.
That's basically where the lore goes. It's like once you do that, you lose your humanity and you become this monster. And that's it. And there's different stories that say it's contagious, and then there's others that say it's not. And there's some stories about people that were basically hunters. You know, they would try to treat people if they could, and then they would kill them if they couldn't. That was the other case that we talked about. It was a guy and his, I want to say his nephew, and they were basically hunters. I think there were shamans, but they were also hunters of the Wendigo, and they were essentially tried and were going to be executed for killing a number of people for being Wendigos. Even though their community was perfectly fine with what they were doing, they hired them to do this. But, outside officials, I believe it was Canadian authorities, when they moved into the area and started overseeing the tribes in that area, they decided to enforce their rules and their laws and their beliefs on these tribes and arrested these men. And I believe they were actually supposed to be set to be freed, but both of them ended up dying before the day they were actually supposed to be let go.
Wow.
So yeah, I think the nephew ended up committing suicide, and I think the main guy who was the shaman, I think he died from like a heart attack or something. I can't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, there's a lot of different stories out there, and it's interesting to see some of...
Well, something you said earlier about whether it's contagious or not just kind of set me wondering. I mean, I wonder if the contagion is some sort of allegory for the contagion of evil. I mean, is evil contagious? I think it is. If you look at the genocides of the 20th century and how many people participated.
Absolutely.
In it, how many normal, quote unquote, people participated in it, it has to be contagious. I think good is contagious too. But,
and then it also goes to like when you have the mob mentality, things of that nature. A lot of times a quote unquote good person is a lot more likely to do something bad when they're surrounded by other people that are doing this thing. And it's, they go with the flow of what everybody else is doing.
Mm-hmm.
You see that a lot, like you said, in history. Absolutely. I think it can definitely be contagious.
It's giving me some ideas for my writing. Thank you.
Right. And I personally like drawing from these kind of stories, and you can look at both the obviously fictional side of it and the nonfiction side of it. Like, clearly these stories and ideas came from somewhere. How much of it is truth is debatable, but clearly there's a source for it. So that's
I think there's... Oh, sorry, I keep interrupting you.
No, you're fine. I just think there's definitely inspiration for stories there. Like, how much of it is true, and like, where are these ideas coming from if they aren't what we've been told or what's been passed down? Where is the genesis? Where's the origin?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jung was onto something with this idea of the collective unconscious, or the inherited unconscious that we all have as part of our DNA.
Right.
Because there are too many similarities, and so much of it does seem to be grounded in basic human psychology, which we would never have used those words, a couple centuries ago. And yet these same ideas about the contagion of evil, about the different archetypes that keep popping up, they're everywhere.
Absolutely. And I've actually, since I started writing, have gotten a lot more into Joseph Campbell's work and some of his theories on archetypes. Definitely one of the things that inspired me to do this podcast, just his idea that there are ingrown archetypes that seem to exist in the subconscious of humanity, and these archetypes basically speak to all of us, which is why they exist, and why they exist in pretty much every narrative. And things that, well, stories that don't make sense to us generally don't follow this structure of, say, the hero's journey. Of course, there's variations, and they can divert from like the main roads a little, but generally there's a consistency to this system. It's there for a reason.
Yeah. I was, there's definitely, when you leave sections out, people notice it, and they may not like a book or movie and not understand why. Like, I was watching, remember the all-female Ghostbusters that came out a couple years back?
Right.
Typically in a story, there's this point called the dark night of the soul, where everything goes wrong. The hero is feeling hopeless. They don't know what they're going to do. They're on the verge of giving up, or they have given up. And then after that, there's a turnaround. And as I was watching the movie, I realized they cut that whole part out. I think they had originally filmed it and then cut it out in edits. And it was just this big gaping hole in the third act, and nothing made sense afterwards.
It helps to build suspense, honestly. And sometimes it can kind of drive you crazy, but a lot of those pieces are there for a reason. I mean, it can come off as formulaic if it's not done correctly, but when it's done right, it makes absolutely all of the sense. And there's a flow to things, and it's supposed to be there, and it works that way. Well, it just works, you know?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's hard to argue with what works. It works, so
yeah, you ignore it at your peril.
Right. So did you have any other interesting stories or experience from overseas that you'd like to share?
I don't know if this qualifies as a paranormal story, but it's kind of funny, I think. So again, when I was in Kyrgyzstan, there's this really big bazaar called the Osh Bazaar. And it was so big that one corner of it was taken up by fortune tellers. And this was the corner where I usually entered the bazaar because it was closest to my house. Well, what I didn't know this one fine morning as I was walking to the Osh Bazaar was that a gang of out-of-town fortune tellers, I think they were from Tajikistan, had invaded the bazaar, and they were very aggressive, and they were pickpocketing people, and they were angering all the other Kyrgyz and Russian fortune tellers who were quite nice. I mean, normally I'd walk through the bazaar and they'd ask if I wanted my fortune told, and I'd say no thank you, and they'd say have a nice day, and I'd walk on. So I walked in, and this woman walks up to me holding a baby, and she asked for some money, so I gave her a few Kyrgyz. And all of a sudden I was surrounded by these women, and my pocket was picked, and the woman who was in front of me had all my money in her hand, and then she did this sleight of hand, and the money disappeared. And so I grabbed her collar, and I said one of the few words I knew in Russian, which is police, and bing, the money reappeared, and she was spitting and making these motions over it, and then she handed me back my money, and then she said that she had blessed the money, and now she wanted payment for it, 50 som. Well, 50 in Russian and is as close to 15 as it is in English. It's pietnatset and pietiset. And when you're a new Russian speaker, it got jumbled in my head. And 50 seemed like kind of a lot for having picked my pocket and then given me my money back. So I said 15, and they got really angry and started shouting at me. All of a sudden, the Russian and Kyrgyz fortune tellers come storming up. They bust into this circle and start screaming at them and say, she's an American, she doesn't know what's going on, leave her alone, blah, 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 blah. And a full-on brawl breaks out. I'm talking fists. People are being punched, hair is being pulled, women are being kicked, eye gouges. It's all happening, and it's all happening around me. And now 50 some seems like a really great deal to get the heck out of there, because the police are going to come and they're going to arrest everybody, including me.
Right.
So I pull out 50 some, I throw it in one direction. A bunch of the Tajik women dive for it, and they kind of created a break in the lines, and I ran through it. I thought I was free, but a bunch of the Tajik women still were chasing after me then, saying, wait, we haven't sold your fortune yet, come back. I think I finally lost them in the meat section of the bazaar, and I did not return to that bazaar for months afterwards. I felt so bad. I'd started a fight.
I can't blame you, though.
Yeah, I hadn't actually started the fight. It was brewing before I got there. I was just the stupid American trigger that walked into the whole thing. But the supernatural, it can be pretty funny. A lot of silly, funny things happen too.
I'm sure. We've talked a little about superstition and related practices. Were there any you've encountered that you found especially unique or interesting?
I think there's I heard about this in Egypt. I never actually encountered it, but I heard about it from several sources, where women would women who were in bad situations in their families or with their husbands would become possessed. And once they became possessed, everybody kind of had to pay attention to them and take them a bit more seriously. And they would eventually have to become, be exorcised and be depossessed. But it was sort of a way for them to take control of a bad situation. So there's a similar theme in our discussion. I think when you don't have power, when everything is out of control, sometimes maybe the supernatural is a way to give yourself an illusion of power, or occasionally actually give yourself some real power. And I thought I wish I could remember the name of this phenomena, but I can't. But apparently it's not too uncommon.
That sounds like a really interesting, I don't even know if superstition would be the right word. I guess practice would probably be a better word.
Yeah, I don't think it's a conscious practice either. I mean, I don't think the women are just throwing fits. I think they really believe they are possessed. The human brain's an interesting thing. And again, that's not to dismiss the actual supernatural. I do believe that ghosts exist. There are things that have happened that I cannot explain. I think there's something out there, but I think psychology has a lot to do with it.
Right. I'm in a similar position. I like to call myself a open-minded skeptic.
You're a Mulder and a Scully.
Yeah, I like to believe that there's definitely more out there than we know, or that science will explain, however you want to put it. But I'm also very skeptical. Like when somebody tells me something, that they saw something or experienced something, my immediate reaction is to be skeptical. So it's like one side wants to be skeptical and the other side absolutely wants to believe what you're telling me. So I won't be dismissive about it, but I'm not going to immediately believe what you're telling me either, if that makes sense. I think it's just a sense of being cautious, and I think you definitely do want to be cautious when it comes to a lot of things. You don't want to automatically believe what somebody's telling you, regardless of what it is, honestly, unless it's somebody you absolutely trust, because as we've talked about before, there's a lot of disinformation out there. So erring on the side of caution is probably always a good practice.
Yeah, it's tough, especially because going back to the idea of, actually, I can't remember if we talked about this or not. I don't think we did talk about this. So there were some studies back in the 1940s, maybe 1950s. They were the first studies on psychic phenomena, and you've probably seen those cards where one card will have a plus and one card will have a sign on it, a star sign on it, and a circle, and then you hold it up face so that the person can't see what the sign is, and they try to guess what the symbol is on the card. And they discovered that when people had positive expectations, they did much better with their guesses. And I found when I read tarot cards, when I'm in a good mood and I'm really up, I also do a much better job with it. So on the one hand, there's this sort of, in order for magic to work, you have to believe in it. But on the other hand, if you believe in everything, you're just a sucker. You're going to totally be taken advantage. I'm sorry, you're a fool. So you have to have some skepticism. So for the magical practitioner, there's a really fine line of belief and healthy skepticism that they have to balance on.
And I like to think that pretty much most things in life are all about balance. Just like we were talking about consuming religion or any kind of substance, it's all about maintaining some level of balance. You don't want to go overboard with anything. You want to be able to pull yourself back and look at things or experience things objectively.
Yeah, I have a paranormal museum mystery series, and the woman who runs the paranormal museum is actually a skeptic, which I thought would be funny since I have her running a paranormal museum. But in book 6, which I've got coming out at the end of January, this is exactly the issue she's struggling with. There's somebody who overdosed on the occult and it ruined her life. And now she's completely anti-occult and she's trying to shut down the museum. And the heroine, Maddie, is like, yeah, that can happen. You can overdose on the occult. Bad things can happen. But at the same time, she loves her museum and she thinks it's, a lot of fun and a lot of good that comes out of it, and that the supernatural is part of the human experience one way or another. And to pretend otherwise or just to assume it's all evil or wrong is probably a mistake.
That makes a lot of sense. Have you actually incorporated any of the superstitions or practices that you encountered abroad into your daily life?
Not ones that I've encountered abroad. Some of, I've got some, like I said, I have some good friends from California who are practitioners of various sorts, and they've introduced me to some really nice morning visualizations and meditations, which I like to use to get my day started, and to try to put myself into a better frame of mind, to make myself more aware of what's going on around me. I mean, I do keep a broom by the door, which is sort of an old witchy superstition. And it's also very handy to have it right by the door.
I always heard the superstition of like using a broom to sweep away negative energy. That was one of the older practices that I always heard of. And I'm not sure. I've been told it was usually like either a Southern thing or typically a Black thing, but the sweeping of your foot, I don't know if you've ever heard that one.
No.
Yeah, and it's weird because I never really encountered that until I was older, just working in different places. If you're sweeping the floor and you get too close to somebody's foot, they will flip out.
Really?
But just be warned. Yeah, because there's this whole thing about if you sweep somebody's foot, it's like almost like stepping on the crack and breaking your mother's back kind of thing. Except if you sweep somebody's foot, then there's this whole likelihood that they'll end up in jail.
Whoa.
So it's kind of a curse thing in that way. And I never really heard that until I got much older. The States are so interesting because you do have all of these superstitions that are from so many different cultures or so many different parts of the world that it's really this great mixing pot. And sometimes these beliefs or practices influence each other. As I was talking earlier with the African diaspora, you have the belief in the Orishas being blended with the Catholic saints becoming Santeria or voodoo, or I can't think of some of the other names of practices off the top of my head, but you have these different beliefs just blending together and sometimes helping people preserve their traditional beliefs. Sometimes it's the only way to allow them to survive. And I don't think that it's exclusive to the African diaspora. You have Irish traditions or Scottish traditions, or even some of the English traditions that have been brought here and have been translated into slightly different versions of their original self.
Yeah, there was this, I don't know if it was a Russian or a Georgian tradition. I think it might have been Russian because I heard it in Kyrgyzstan and the Republic of Georgia, that if you're at a party and you're seated and you sit at the corner of a table, you're not going to get married. It seems really silly, but then I was thinking about it. I was like, well, let's see. If you're the person who gets jammed into the corner of the table, probably means you're not, stepping out and putting yourself forward quite as much, and maybe that's why you don't get married.
I can see that. And sometimes there's a logic to it. There really is a logic to some of these superstitions when you actually, like we were saying before, when you actually start looking at their origins, you kind of see where these ideas came from. Kind of talking about just some of the myths and folklore out there. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Selkie. Kelpie is the one I'm thinking of. There's a Kelpie and then there's the Selkie. The Kelpie is the horse.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the Kelpie is basically this water horse, and it's I think the story goes, you'll be walking on the beach or whatever, and you'll just see this stallion or mare. I don't remember whether it's male or female, but you'll see this random horse just like walking on the beach. And it's just like dancing around trying to get you to, come play with it or ride it or whatever. Problem is, when you go to get on this horse and you touch its hide, you get stuck. Once you put your hand on it, you can't take your hand off. And then this horse will proceed to go into the water where it will drown you and then feed on you. And this story is pretty much believed to be a way to get children to keep away from the water, because the water was a dangerous place to be, especially depending on what body of water you're near. If you go out to the water and you get pulled by a current, you're gone. There's no saving you, especially back then. So a lot of these stories were warnings to keep people safe. Yeah. And it's a creepy story, this beautiful horse that once you play with it, and once you touch it, you're gone. It drinks.
Yes, it's not a Disney fairy tale, is it?
No, not at all. The Selkie is a whole nother story that has its own problems. But the Selkie is basically the seal, kind of like a mermaid story, where this seal that is able to take off its skin and transform into a human. Now, its skin stays there, it sits there, and they generally will go and hide it somewhere so they can go and put it back on later. Well, part of the legend with that goes that if you happen to find this Selkie's hide and hide it so that they can't find it themselves, you could force the Selkie to marry you. So there's legends where this has happened. There's one where a Selkie had this happen to them, and they had 2 or 3 children, a whole family, and one day one of their kids just so happened to find where the dad had hidden their mom's fur, didn't know what it was, and the mom realized what it was. She put it back on, and her family never saw her again. So you have stories like that, and it's really creepy when you think about it now, and some of the connotations. You're basically abducting somebody and forcing them to marry you against their will. Not really sure the origins of that story or what they were trying to get at.
Don't marry Selkies.
Well, to me, the Selkie is the victim in this story.
Yeah,
because they were just minding their own business, and here you're hiding part of who they are, so they're forced to basically submit to what you want them to do. So they're very much the victim in that story. Of course, there's similar stories like the Japanese Kitsune, where you have a fox spirit that will turn into a human, and they will convince somebody to marry them only to harm them later. So that's the opposite end, where it's the animal tricking the human and not the other way around. So I think that was more so to steer away from women or men that are especially charismatic or flirtatious, because they're going to bring you to ruin. That kind of thing. Again, it's interesting to see where some of these stories come from and their origins, and especially experiencing them firsthand like you have. So after all you've seen, for better or worse, how have your direct experiences among other cultures influenced your personal outlook? I know you've touched a little on how lucky we are here in the States and just how far we've come as far as life expectancy and whatnot.
I think it's given me a better appreciation for other cultures as well as for the American culture. And it makes me kind of question more assumptions about what people say and what people do. And sometimes people say things and it's not meant in a bad way, but because of, different cultural clashes, it might seem that way. And you kind of have to step back and say, wait, what's happening here? And the whole time I was overseas, there was a lot of wait, what's happening here moments, especially because there were language difficulties and other things in between us. So it just made me ask a lot more questions. And
there's definitely cultural context.
Yeah. Just question my own assumptions before reacting.
Right. I think that's something that we probably all could do a little bit more of. As I've touched on briefly, I was inspired to create this podcast to learn and discuss some of the archetypal beliefs that you've likely experienced firsthand, the similarities and the differences that exist among various groups of people across the globe. Do you feel as though your time abroad has granted you any additional insight into people as a whole? I imagine that there's nothing like living among people whose cultures and beliefs are vastly different than what you were raised around.
I think it gave me a better understanding about what it means to be an outsider. I mean, as an American, I was frequently a privileged outsider, but at the same time, the foreigner is always the one who's suspected of dirty dealings because they're the foreigner. I mean, some of it's the silly things, like I spoke Russian pretty good, and going into the post office and the very nice lady behind the desk shouting at me at the top of her lungs, because if she shouted at me really slowly, then I would understand her better. It's just silly stuff like that. But
it's funny because those are like the same things we do to outsiders here,
Absolutely. I've done it to people for sure. And I catch myself doing it. I think, don't.
Like speaking louder is not going to get them to understand a different language better.
Speaking more slowly helps, for sure.
Yeah, sometimes that definitely
helps. But the
helps.
volume doesn't help at all.
Right.
But just you don't know what it's like to be an outsider until you are an outsider. And that was a unique experience for me, and it was frustrating and it was funny, and it's something which I hope I never forget.
I think being on the other side definitely would help a lot of people to know what that feels like. I can definitely see how that would change any person's outlook. Such experiences, either having them directly or learning about them from someone like yourself, are crucial to our garnering understanding and tolerance. So I appreciate your work and your sharing.
Well, thank you.
Do you have any final thoughts or anything else you'd like to share?
Yes, buy my books.
Absolutely.
Actually, if people are interested in getting my shorter stories, if they subscribe to my newsletter on my website, they can get them for free, part of the newsletter package.
So there's definitely no reason for any of you to not do that.
Yeah, if you don't like it, you can always unsubscribe. No hard feelings.
Right. And they sound like they're definitely worth checking out.
I think they're fun and different. And it's nice to have them delivered to your inbox.
Right. Who doesn't love a free story? Well, I'm glad we finally got to talk. Since the first time we spoke, I was excited to hear more about your story, and it makes me even more interested in reading your work. If any of my listeners feel similarly inclined to check out you or your books, the links to your website and social media will be in the show notes. I think that's going to be it for now. Kirsten, again, it was so great having you here with me tonight. Thanks for sharing your journey and experiences with us, sincerely.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me on. I really enjoyed this conversation.
I hope you have a great night. Take care, and please be safe.
I know this is an unusually long episode, so I don't want to keep you all any longer. I think I learned a few things, and it was amazing to hear about those encounters and experiences firsthand. I'm sure if Kirsten wrote about her life and filled it with these stories, it'd be a bestseller. So I hope you found her as amazing and entertaining as I did. And I hope some of you take the time to check out more of her work. I am not the same, having seen the moon shine on the other side of the world. Marianne Rodmacher. Next episode, I have an even better surprise in store for you, and I can't wait. Some of you may already know my guest, or at least have seen his work. In honor of the holiday season, he and I will be talking creepy Christmas, so I hope you will join us. For now, Assalamu alaikum and namaste. Peace be with you until we meet again. Thanks for listening to me as I've nerded out about stories and beliefs. Join me next week as I journey down the rabbit hole once again by subscribing and listening wherever podcasts are available. Leave me a comment on iTunes. 5-star reviews are always great and help others find the podcast. Also, you can email me at faithandfearpodcast@gmail.com. And lastly, share with others you feel may enjoy or get something out of these conversations. Who knows, maybe then we'll be one step closer to glimpsing the true nature of faith and fear. Music courtesy of Pixabay.com.